Imagine for a moment the court of Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. Great halls lit by chandeliers, tapestries recounting ancient imperial feats, and corridors where the murmurs of foreign diplomats echoed. But those visitors were not speaking of conquests, nor of treaties, nor of victories. What they commented on, with astonishment at times tinged with disgust, was the king's behavior. A monarch who, instead of worrying about saving his nation from ruin and disorder, seemed obsessed with his body, with his virility, and with personal whims that bordered on the grotesque. That king was Ferdinand of Bourbon, known to history as Ferdinand VII, son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. He was born in the year 1784, and from childhood he was seen as the great hope of the dynasty at a critical moment. Hence, the people enthusiastically called him the Desired. On him, they projected the illusion of a better future, a monarch who would rescue Spain from crisis and restore its lost splendor. But reality would be very different. What began as the hope of a nation ended in the bitterest disappointment. His reign transformed him into the Felon King, a far less glorious title that marked him forever as a traitor, a despot, and a figure mocked across Europe. The question that then arises is inevitable. How did a prince called to be a savior end up becoming one of the most hated and ridiculed monarchs in Spanish history? To answer it, we must walk through the dark corridors of his public and private life. Ferdinand VII is not remembered only for his political decisions. His name is surrounded by a fog of rumors, sexual scandals, tragic marriages, and obsessions that bordered on the pathological. While Spain was experiencing foreign invasions, civil wars, and deep social divisions, he seemed more concerned with proving his virility before the court, humiliating his wives, and surrounding himself with doctors who would attest to his potency. On this journey, we will see the man behind the title, the young prince marked by traumas, the monarch who harshly repressed his own people, the husband who turned intimacy into a public spectacle, and the king who ended up as a caricature in Europe's courts. We will delve into the Spain of Bourbon decadence, into its political crises, into the personal tragedies of four queens bound to a man more obsessed with his own body than with his throne, and into the legends that made Ferdinand VII as grotesque as he was fascinating. This is the mystery of Ferdinand VII, the man who went from being the Desired to becoming the most perverted king in history. To understand the figure of Ferdinand VII, it is necessary to go back to the end of the 18th century, a period in which Spain was no longer the great power it had been. The empire built on the riches of the Americas was in frank decline. The colonies, though still under Spanish control, were increasingly difficult to administer and maintain. The continuous wars against England, Holland, and France had drained the state's coffers. The economy was propped up by loans, the prices of basic goods were soaring, and corruption was entrenched at every level of the administration. Meanwhile, the Bourbon court in Madrid seemed to live with its back to that reality. The reign of Charles IV, father of Ferdinand, was perceived as a weak government, dominated by the figure of his wife, Maria Luisa of Parma, and by the omnipresent Manuel Godoy, royal favorite and one of the most hated figures of the time. For many, effective power was in the hands of this ambitious and controversial minister, which left the monarch in an almost decorative role. In that environment, Ferdinand was born and raised. From childhood, he was subjected to a rigid education aimed at reinforcing his sense of duty but contradictory in its application. While tutors repeated that he should be a strong and feared monarch, in practice, they kept him isolated, under constant surveillance, and limited in his intellectual formation. He did not receive the humanist preparation that characterized other European princes, but rather instruction centered on obedience and religion. This lack of openness made him timid, distrustful, and with little capacity for dialogue. The role of Manuel Godoy in Ferdinand's life was decisive. Godoy, as the queen's favorite, wielded enormous influence over the court, and the young prince's animosity toward him was profound. His relationship with his mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, was marked by distrust and coldness. Many historians point out that Ferdinand saw in her and in Godoy an alliance that sidelined him, prevented him from gaining political prominence, and even humiliated him. That perception of constant conspiracy within his own family fostered in him a resentful and vengeful character. Confrontation with his parents was a central element of his youth. Ferdinand conspired on several occasions against Charles IV and Maria Luisa, seeking support among nobles and soldiers who also detested Godoy. These palace intrigues ended up consolidating in him an obsession to prove that he deserved the throne and could be a strong ruler. However, that fixation was not accompanied by a clear political vision. It was more a personal struggle to impose himself within a dysfunctional family and in an environment full of petty quarrels. Personally, the young Ferdinand was described as a timid prince with little self-confidence. His tutors presented him as reserved, melancholic in character, and inclined to distrust. That insecurity made him easily manipulated by those who managed to win his favor. Despite his timidity, he was obsessed with power, with the idea of being recognized and feared, which manifested in a constant need to prove his worth before the court and before his allies. The most intimate aspects of his life also began to come to light during that stage. Various court doctors recorded his first sexual frustrations. There is talk of a repressed character, of physical difficulties that affected his intimate life and that later would become a cause of public humiliation. Some medical documents mention the possibility that he suffered from phimosis or partial impotence, conditions that, in the context of the time, were not only a personal problem but a matter of state. The prince's ability to beget heirs was closely watched, and any sign of weakness generated doubts about the continuity of the dynasty. The court's pressure on his virility marked him deeply. In a society where the masculinity of the monarch was directly associated with the strength of the kingdom, Ferdinand grew up under the weight of having to prove something that, in private, he was not sure he could fulfill. This tension between what was expected of him and what he could actually offer became a psychological wound that accompanied him throughout his life. The repression he suffered in childhood and youth was reflected in his view of power, sex, and religion. Instead of finding serenity and faith, he used it as a refuge to justify his fears and obsessions. Politically, he developed a suspicious character, always on alert for possible betrayals, even from his own allies. Sexually, that repression transformed into a need to demonstrate his virility in an exaggerated and grotesque manner, a trait that would later make him famous in Europe for reasons far from honorable. Thus, the childhood and youth of Ferdinand VII were marked by a country in decline, a fractured royal family, and an education that shaped him more as a fearful and resentful man than as a prince prepared to reign. These early experiences not only explain part of his personal defects, but help us understand how, when he finally reached the throne, he became a ruler incapable of guiding his nation, yet obsessed with imposing himself in the most intimate aspects of his life. In 1808, Spain was plunged into one of its greatest crises. The invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte had shaken the foundations of the monarchy, and amid that chaos, Ferdinand, still a prince, presented himself to public opinion as the savior who would confront the French emperor. The young Bourbon appeared as the alternative to the discredited Charles IV and the hated Manuel Godoy. The people saw him as a symbol of hope, a prince willing to resist foreign interference and defend national dignity. But that heroic image would crumble very soon. In what is known as the abdication of Bayonne, Ferdinand betrayed the expectations placed upon him. At first, he presented himself as defiant before Napoleon, winning popular admiration. However, just a few days later, he submitted to the emperor's pressure and ended up ceding his dynastic rights. It was an act that many contemporaries interpreted as a shameful capitulation. Napoleon took advantage of the situation to place his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, leaving Ferdinand as a king without a kingdom, and for many, as a traitor to the national cause. During the years that followed, while Spain bled in the War of Independence, Ferdinand remained in France, a prisoner in Valenciennes, but with privileges that contrasted with his people's suffering. From there, he sent ambiguous messages, at times encouraging resistance, at others hinting at agreements with Napoleon. That ambiguity was the seed of the distrust that would surround him all his life. In 1814, after the French defeat, Ferdinand returned to Spain. He was received as a hero. The streets of Madrid and of many cities of the realm filled with cheers, chants, and tears. The crowd hailed him as the desired. In a country exhausted by 6 years of war, the monarch's return seemed to signal the restoration of order and the hope of a better future. However, the illusion lasted little. Barely arrived, Ferdinand showed his true face, that of a despotic and vengeful ruler. One of his first decisions was to annul the Constitution of Cadiz of 1812, one of the most advanced of its time. With a gesture, he destroyed the efforts of the liberals who had risked their lives to draft that text, the fruit of a nation's sacrifice in wartime. He restored absolutism, returning all powers to the throne and making clear that his reign would not be marked by modernity or liberty, but by repression. Persecution was immediate. The liberals who had defended the Constitution were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Censorship intensified. Universities and academies were placed under surveillance to eradicate any enlightened ideas. Spain, which had glimpsed the possibility of a constitutional future, was thrust back into the darkness of the most rigid absolutism. While the country grew poorer, agriculture reeled from the war, and hunger spread, Ferdinand seemed to live in another world. His court became a stage for excesses. He devoted long hours to endless banquets, surrounded by flatterers who feared contradicting him. He took part in obscene games, tasteless jokes, and amusements that scandalized foreign diplomats. One of the most striking aspects of his private life was his obsession with his virility. Court doctors visited him frequently to examine and attest to his sexual potency. These examinations, which today may seem grotesque, were part of a public staging in which Ferdinand sought to reaffirm himself as a man and as a king. It was a way to compensate for the insecurity that had marked him since youth, and to try to silence rumors about his impotence and physical difficulties. Foreign ambassadors left devastating testimonies about him. French and English reports describe him as an obese, sickly man of ridiculous appearance. They noted his gluttony, capricious character, and scant ability to sustain affairs of state conversations. Instead of a monarch concerned with rebuilding his realm, they found a man focused on his most immediate pleasures and on his constant need to prove a virility under suspicion. It is in this stage that his historical nickname was consolidated, the Felon King. The word felon is no accident. It means traitor, unworthy of trust, someone who breaks his commitments. And that is exactly what Ferdinand represented for many of his contemporaries. He betrayed the people who had welcomed him as a savior, the liberals who had fought against the French, the international allies who supported his return, and even his own partisans, whom he manipulated and sacrificed according to his momentary interests. The contradiction between the country's misery and the king's excesses became a symbol of Bourbon decadence. While peasants suffered hunger and cities sought to recover from the ravages of war, Ferdinand surrendered himself to banquets, absurd medical examinations, and personal obsessions that distanced him from any notion of responsibility. From hero against Napoleon, he became a tyrant ridiculed inside and outside Spain. His figure condensed the worst of an absolutist monarch at a time when Europe was moving toward new forms of government. That contrast between a changing world and a king clinging to the past made Ferdinand VII a character hated, feared, and also mocked. His reign, marked by betrayal, repression, and ridicule, laid the groundwork for a divided and backward Spain, where tensions between liberals and absolutists would spill into endless conflicts. And meanwhile, the Felon King continued to seek at court the recognition of something he had never achieved: respect as a man and as a monarch. If the political life of Ferdinand VII was marked by betrayal and absolutism, his married life was no less scandalous. 4 women shared his bed and his fate, and in each case the union was tinged with tragedy, humiliation, and rumors that fed the king's black legend. Maria Antonia of Naples, the first victim. Ferdinand's first marriage was to Maria Antonia of Naples, daughter of King Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies. The wedding was celebrated in 1802, when the prince was barely 18 years old. From the start, it was a cold marriage, lacking affection and riddled with political tension. The young queen, lively and strong-willed, found herself trapped in a court dominated by intrigues and by the omnipresent Manuel Godoy, whom she deeply hated. Accounts of the time say that Ferdinand treated his wife with indifference and that his parents did not receive her warmly either. Maria Antonia lived surrounded by whispers and suspicions. When she died in 1806, at 21 years of age, rumors spread that she had been poisoned, perhaps on the orders of the Queen Mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, who saw her as a threat. It was never proven, but the shadow of poison clung to the memory of that first wife, turned into a victim of a loveless marriage and a ruthless court. Isabella of Braganza, the cultured queen ignored by her husband. After the death of Maria Antonia, Ferdinand married again in 1816, already king. The chosen bride was Isabella of Braganza, a Portuguese princess known for her culture and refinement. Isabella loved the arts and even promoted the creation of the Prado Museum, one of the most valuable legacies of her brief reign. However, her marriage to Ferdinand was marked by indifference and coldness. The king showed her no affection, and tensions in private life were aggravated by the pressure to beget an heir. In 1818, Isabella died after a complicated labor that did not come to a good end. Chroniclers note that Ferdinand showed scarcely any mourning, as if his wife's death were an inconvenience rather than a personal tragedy. The image of an insensitive king took hold. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the wedding of public humiliation. Ferdinand's third marriage was the most controversial and the most grotesque. In 1819, he married Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a German princess of only 15 years, deeply religious and raised in an atmosphere of rigid Catholic morality. The young woman arrived in Spain terrified, not only by the figure of her husband, but also by what awaited her in the royal bedchamber. Legend, handed down by multiple chroniclers and travelers, says that the marriage was consummated in the presence of confessors and doctors who attended to certify the queen's virginity and the king's potency. The scene, more like a humiliating spectacle than an intimate act, shows how far the court of Ferdinand VII had turned the monarch's sexuality into a matter of state. For Maria Josepha, it was a Calvary. Her religiosity clashed with the crudeness of an environment in which she was examined like an object. The queen lived at court like a prisoner. She never had children and died in 1829 at barely 25 years of age. Accounts describe her as a sad young woman, marked by repression and by the public humiliation to which she was subjected. Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, the last wife and the obsession with an heir. In 1829, already ill and in greatly deteriorated health, Ferdinand married for the fourth and last time to Maria Cristina of Bourbon II Sicilies, his niece, barely a young woman of 23 years. This time the principal motivation was clear. The king needed to secure an heir to guarantee the dynasty's continuity. The pressure was enormous. Ferdinand was obese, afflicted with gout and other ailments, yet obsessed with proving that he could still beget a successor. The entire court turned into a stage for grotesque medical examinations. Doctors and surgeons verified the king's fertility and the queen's virginity, while gossip swirled about the chances that the union would bear fruit. Finally, Maria Cristina gave birth to Isabella II, securing the succession and calming the anxieties of a king who would die shortly thereafter in 1833. However, even this outcome was marked by controversy. Isabella's birth did not resolve dynastic tensions, and her accession to the throne sparked the Carlist Wars, plunging Spain into decades of conflict, marriages of humiliation and tragedy. Throughout his 4 marriages, Ferdinand VII failed to weave fruitful political alliances or consolidate the kingdom's stability. On the contrary, each wedding was accompanied by tragedy, humiliation, or scandal. His wives died young, subjected to unbearable pressures, victims of a court obsessed with the monarch's virility and with the need for an heir at any cost. Far from the romantic image of dynastic matches that secured alliances among realms, the marriages of Ferdinand VII symbolized the decadence of a monarchy that had lost its way. Public humiliations, rumors of impotence, absurd medical examinations, and the tragedies of young women trapped in a cruel fate fed the black legend of a king whose private life was as scandalous as his political life. Instead of consolidating the dynasty, those marriages reinforced the perception of Ferdinand as a grotesque monarch, incapable of ruling either in intimacy or on the throne. The legend of Ferdinand VII cannot be understood without pausing at one of the most grotesque and most discussed facets of his private life: his obsession with virility. In a court marked by decadence, illness, and ridicule, the king turned his body into a public spectacle and his member into a matter of state. What should have remained in the intimate sphere became a constant exhibition, fueling rumors, satires, and caricatures that turned him into the laughingstock of Europe. From youth, Ferdinand had shown a morbid concern with proving that he was capable of siring offspring. The dynastic pressure was enormous. Spain needed an heir to ensure the continuity of the Bourbons. But rumors about his possible impotence or physical difficulties spread quickly through the court. Some doctors mentioned the possibility that he suffered from phimosis or partial impotence that made the consummation of his marriages very difficult. These difficulties, far from being handled discreetly, became the subject of comments, medical reports, and gossip that spread rapidly. In that context, Ferdinand reacted in the most outlandish way. He sought to prove by exhibition what he perhaps did not achieve in the bedchamber. There are testimonies from doctors and courtiers asserting that the king did not hesitate to show his member in public with a boastful tone, as if by displaying himself he could silence the rumors that pursued him. He did so before doctors summoned to vouch for his potency, but also before trusted courtiers, whom he humiliated by forcing them to witness those grotesque demonstrations. Far from reinforcing his authority, these behaviors further fed the gossip. The image of an obese, sickly monarch plagued by gout and digestive problems, who insisted on exhibiting his virility in such a vulgar way, was almost caricatural. The contrast was cruel. While the king could barely walk without help owing to his ailments, he insisted on proving that his body was still that of a man capable of procreation. His illnesses, possibly venereal as well, aggravated that image of decadence. The very body that was coming apart under the effects of obesity and disease was exhibited as if it were a symbol of power. The entire court was dragged into this spectacle. The intimacy of royal marriages, already controlled by doctors and confessors, became an almost theatrical matter. The consummation of his weddings was treated as a public event, with designated witnesses to certify that the king had fulfilled his conjugal duty. It was not only Ferdinand's personal ridicule, it was also the humiliation of his wives, forced to live under the scrutiny of doctors and courtiers. Rumor and satire found fertile ground in this setting. In France and England, pamphlets, drawings, and caricatures began to circulate in which Ferdinand appeared as a grotesque king with a swollen belly, legs deformed by gout, and an obscene gesture alluding to his phallic obsession. European satire turned him into a ridiculous character, a monarch obsessed with sex but incapable of fulfilling his role as king. The cartoons portrayed him as a decadent tyrant, a man defeated by his own body, more concerned with private boasting than with governing. The most interesting thing about this legend is that, beyond the lurid details or the exaggeration of pamphleteers, it reveals a deeper symbol. Ferdinand VII's phallus was not only an object of personal mockery, it became a metaphor for absolute power in decline. His obsession with appearing virile reflected the real impotence of his reign, incapable of saving Spain from ruin and internal division. The grotesque exhibition of his body only highlighted the weakness of a monarchy sustained more by appearance than by substance. For contemporaries, the contradiction was evident. The king, who proclaimed himself defender of absolutism and order, showed himself in private as an obscene buffoon, ridiculed even by those who feared him. That distance between the public image of a despotic monarch and the private image of a man obsessed with his virility made Ferdinand VII go down in history not only as the Felon King, but also as one of the most grotesque and perverted monarchs of his time. His sick body turned into spectacle, his wives treated as objects of medical verification, his courtiers forced to attend humiliating scenes, and his enemies, who found in those rumors the perfect excuse to ridicule him. These built the legend of the phallic myth of Ferdinand VII, a legend that, beyond the grotesque, symbolizes the impotence of an entire monarchy that was crumbling while its king kept trying, again and again, to prove he was still a man. The last years of Ferdinand VII perfectly represented the decadence of his reign. Ill, obese, afflicted with gout, ulcers, and respiratory problems, he could barely walk and spent most of his time cloistered in the palace. The image of the monarch, once received with cheers as the desired, had been reduced to that of a man defeated by his own body and by the consequences of a life of excess. The court, far from offering dignity in his final days, became a nest of flatterers and doctors orbiting around him, competing for favors and privileges while the country sank into misery. The king surrounded himself with doctors who tried to alleviate his ailments with increasingly desperate remedies, many of them useless or even counterproductive. The testimonies of ambassadors and chroniclers of the time concur in describing a grotesque, almost tragic-comic atmosphere in which the monarch's illness was treated as a public spectacle. Ferdinand was often seen in bed, bloated, covered in sores, and yet still obsessed with his virility, as if proving that he could beget an heir were more important than the state of the nation. The political situation was no better. The country suffered the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars, the loss of almost all American colonies, and a ruined economy. The repression against the liberals had left deep wounds, and social division was increasingly violent. In that context, Ferdinand decided to play one of his last political cards, ensuring that his daughter, Isabella, would inherit the throne. To that end, he promulgated in 1830 the so-called Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that abolished the Salic law introduced by the Bourbons and that prevented women from inheriting the crown. With this move, Ferdinand VII ensured that Isabella, his daughter with Maria Cristina of Bourbon-Two Sicilies, would be his successor. But that decision opened an even deeper wound. His brother, Charles Maria Isidore, felt betrayed and claimed his rights to the throne. The conflict between supporters of Isabella and the Carlists led, after the monarch's death in 1833, to a civil war that bloodied Spain for decades. Thus, even in his death, Ferdinand VII sowed division and violence. His obsession with leaving descendants, with securing his dynastic legacy, ended by provoking one of the bloodiest wars of the 19th century. The king who had promised unity left behind a torn and embattled country, condemned to years of internal strife. Ferdinand's death came on the 29th of September of 1833. He was 49 years old, but looked like an old man consumed by disease. Gout had deformed his body, obesity had weakened him, and infections and fevers had left him prostrate. Some chroniclers describe his passing as a slow and painful process in which the doctors could do little. He died surrounded by his wife and courtiers, but without the people's respect or Europe's recognition. His burial, far from being a solemn act that united the nation in mourning, was perceived with indifference by many and with relief by others. For his absolutist supporters, Ferdinand had been a firm king who kept the throne in difficult times. For the majority, however, his memory was tinged with repression, betrayal, and scandal. The legacy of Ferdinand VII has been harshly judged by historians and chroniclers. For many, he is considered the worst king in the history of Spain, a monarch who not only failed to halt the empire's decline, but accelerated it with his despotism, incompetence, and lack of political vision. While other European nations advanced toward progress, Spain remained anchored in a threadbare absolutism, unable to modernize. But beyond politics, Ferdinand VII entered the collective memory as a symbol of moral decadence. His private life, marked by sexual scandals, grotesque exhibitionism, and humiliations of his wives, became the reflection of a decomposed power in which the intimate and the public were confused in an indecorous spectacle. The king who should have embodied the monarchy's greatness became an object of mockery in Europe, portrayed in pamphlets and caricatures as an obese, sick, and impotent man obsessed with a power he no longer possessed. Ferdinand VII left no memory of conquests, reforms, or achievements. His name remained associated with betrayal, political repression, and personal excesses. His nickname, the Felon King, accompanied him forever, a reminder that he betrayed everyone: the people who acclaimed him, the liberals who dreamed of a modern country, the absolutists who trusted him, and even his own family, whom he condemned to civil war with his last decision. In perspective, his figure embodies the contradiction of a Spain that, in the 19th century, still looked to the past while the rest of Europe moved toward the future. Ferdinand was not a leader capable of guiding his people in times of crisis, but a monarch trapped in his obsessions, unable to distinguish between the grandeur of power and the pettiness of his own desires. Remembered by his contemporaries with contempt, by foreign diplomats with derision, and by posterity with revulsion, Ferdinand VII was inscribed in history not as a glorious king, but as a warning of what happens when power is reduced to repression, when the crown becomes a stage for excess, and when the monarch's figure degrades into caricature. His name still resonates as a symbol of political and moral decadence. He is not remembered for great military feats, nor for bold reforms, nor for the flowering of the arts or sciences. He is remembered for despotism, for betrayals, and for scandals, and above all, for that obscene and ridiculous facet that made him the laughingstock of Europe, that of a king obsessed with his virility, incapable of governing, turned into the grotesque shadow of what he once promised to be. Thus ended the life of Ferdinand VII, the man who was born as the Desired and died as the most perverted king in history. This survival medicine did not always manage to save lives, but it did sustain a social fabric in which the community involved itself in the healing of its members. The rituals, although ineffective from the standpoint of modern medicine, provided comfort and a sense of control in the face of the unpredictability of illness. And in a world where death was always near, that could be as important as the cure itself.